company dedicated to enhancing leaders' ability to harness and optimize trust as a strategic business asset. One of the questions I get often asked is, can you trust too much? I mean, we say our podcast, our whole platform here is trust is the difference. But can you trust too much? Let's talk about that one today.
Do you want an answer?
Absolutely.
The answer is yes, right?
Yeah.
Now, as we talk about optimization, you can trust too little and you can trust too much. Mm-hmm. It's all about context. And so reading the context is an important skill to learn how to do in an organizational setting. Absolutely. So let's define these things. So we're talking about trust, but then some of the things that are some concepts that are related to trust would be mistrust and distrust. And these are all three very discrete things, measurable, definable things. So mistrust is just a general lack of willful vulnerability. So it's not trust, it's not a willful vulnerability, it's a general lack of willful vulnerability. Whereas distrust is a specific lack of willful vulnerability. So the difference between those two is information and context.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It leads me to think about when you talk about that idea of trust is really a continuum, right? It's and we always say trust is a choice. You choose to trust or not trust. And one of the things I often hear from people is, hey, I'm a very trusting person. I give people my trust, very trusting. But once you break it, you're never getting it back. And I feel like that's a missed opportunity in some respects that there again, it's a continuum. And as you talk about it, trust, mistrust, no trust, I think it'd be helpful to talk about how we judge that trust. There's different components of trust. The ABI model, correct?
That's right. Yeah. Ability, benevolence, and integrity. Yeah. Those are the three calculative things that we process in our minds, a lot of times more involuntarily than voluntarily, kind of processing that in the background about the trustee, the person that we are considering trusting or distrusting. So, hey, we're processing these things, but we're also factoring in our affect. How are we feeling? How do we feel outside of their ability, the focus on their ability and their benevolence and their integrity? How do I feel? How am I feeling right now? How trusting am I generally, but also specifically in this context, unrelated to that particular person and what they're going to do? Mm-hmm. So these are things that we're processing all the time.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We're constantly processing them, and yet, do people really have that framework, as you called it, the ability, integrity, and benevolence, to understand why they're making that decision? I'm not trusting that person again. And in that moment, when I hear this, when I hear people say, if you broke my trust, you'll never get it back, I often say, would the person know that? Would they know they broke your trust? Would you have a conversation about that? Or do you just make that decision and then no longer trust? And I think that's a challenge, on both sides. It's difficult to be vulnerable. As we say, it's a choice to be vulnerable. And yet, at the same time, our work, if we talk from a professional environment, requires trust. So much of what we talk about is that trust is the foundation. So how do we get to helping people use this framework of ABI to really, put a optimization lens on trust, not a maximizing, not an all or nothing, but more of an optimization?
Yeah, well, trust, mistrust, and distrust, they're continuums, right? So you can highly trust, or you can have just enough trust in a particular person for a particular purpose and context that just pushes it over the line to, yes, I'm going to willingly make myself vulnerable, but just barely. Mm-hmm. Or you can be on the other side of that hump into distrust, where it's like, I'm choosing not to make myself willfully vulnerable to them in this particular context for this purpose. And so that decision, that's a big decision. It's harder to go from distrust back to trust. Mm-hmm. It's much easier to go from low trust to distrust. And that example you provided, that makes sense. It's easy for people, I think, in our transient workplaces where people are moving constantly, highly mobile, moving from one place to another, it's easy to have short-term relationships and short-term perspectives, on our work relationships. And then we go from, I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt, but then they did something, whatever it was, it pushed me over the line and I went extreme into distrust. And maybe I didn't even communicate it with them. I just feel this way now and I'm not going to trust them. And they don't even realize it or know it. But then it gets to the point where if I don't communicate it, then I leave the team or I leave the organization and continue that toxic process elsewhere. So it's better just to deal with it, be candid, deal with it. I get it. Those are very Western values to have candor and be in directness, but that's the environments we're talking about primarily. And so in the American workplace, it can have high value to be candid with each other.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point of being able to have that conversation and perhaps this framework of ability. Can they do it? I need to trust that someone is going to follow through and do what they say they're going to do. Or is it the integrity, their will? Can I trust them that they're gonna do this? And then why they do it, the benevolence of, are they really doing it for the reason, the shared purpose that we have and to achieve our goals, or are they doing it more for themselves? So using that framework to have a conversation first with yourself of why did I lose trust in this situation, and being able to break that down and not be all or nothing, but sort of optimize where can I trust them? Because as we know in relationships at work, trust is the difference. And it allows our interdependency to get work done to happen. So I feel like this gives a framework and an opportunity, as you say, to have that conversation, at least first with yourself, to understand why the trust might have been broken. And then secondly, we would encourage to have the conversation with the person in terms of how did the trust get weakened, and can you repair it? I've seen many situations where it's been repaired, and oftentimes those difficult conversations result in a even higher level of trust and significant relationship, because now we've put a difficult thing on the table and we've solved it.
Yeah, I think this speaks well for building a purposeful trust plan for each of us entering our workspaces and even our home spaces and our recreational spaces. Having a purposeful trust plan in place can help alleviate some of those issues.
Wonderful. Love it. Purposeful trust plan. Let's encourage our listeners to give us some feedback on that and how that might help them in their relationships, both at work, at home, in the community. Would love to hear your questions, and we can unpack that a little bit further on another call.